Welcome to the Being Known podcast with my friend, Dr. Kurt Thompson.
And my friend, Pepper Sweeney.
We are here to discover and explore what it means to be truly known. And we are here today, season 4, episode 6 of the Being Known podcast. And today we're going to talk about a very lighthearted subject of trauma and shame. The madness of I knew that was going to happen. It happens to the best of us sometimes, and I am the best of us. So
and I was going to say, you had to keep me from saying, and it happens to you too.
Yes, yeah. I can't give you a gap, because if I do, I'm going to get insulted. I've learned. The madness of self-perpetuation.
Wait, could you say that one more time?
The madness of self-perpetuation.
And then, no, I won't. Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Oh my gosh. No,
Listen,
it's okay.
That's why I get paid the big bucks to pronounce words improperly. Good to be here with you again, Kurt. So let's jump into this. I know we want to start off by talking a little bit about shame. Something that for those of you who aren't familiar with, Kurt has written a whole book on, and the anatomy of shame. So it's a great resource for you. If you haven't had an opportunity to read that book, I highly recommend it. And it's a great way to jump into this subject. Go ahead, Kurt.
Well, I think, it's sometimes we might say, well, gosh, when it comes to trauma, and you talk about shame, they almost feel redundant in the sense that, like, well, what trauma doesn't have shame? And I think what we're trying to do in this episode is just to highlight the way shame shows up, in particular in those events that we have experienced as being traumatic, and recognizing that we can feel shame under certain circumstances in which those circumstances turn out not to be traumatic. But shame in many respects is often wielded by any situation, no matter how large or small, as one of evil's mechanisms of traumatizing us. And, we talk about the title of this episode, Trauma and Shame, the Madness of Self-Perpetuation. We're going to highlight just a couple of features of shame that stand out in trauma. And one of them that we're really going to pay a lot of attention to is this way that shame tends to, we encounter it, and then it tends to repeat itself. We encounter it, and then I feel ashamed about something that has happened, and then I feel ashamed about this, and it just snowballs on itself. Just to review, we've started with this concept of trauma and the mind in general, and then we were breaking that down. First, we talked about trauma and the brain. In our last episode, we talked about trauma and the body. And with shame, trauma and shame, we're really talking about how shame plays itself out along all of these lines in our physicality, in the activity of our brain, how that affects the how that shapes and strengthens the disintegration of the mind along the way. And one of the ways that we begin to talk about this is just to remind our audience that shame, first and foremost, is a neurophysiological event. It is a thing that begins in our body. Now, we might say, well, gosh, it didn't really begin in my body. Kurt, it began with, my uncle perpetrating sexual abuse. And that's not untrue. But the way that we first encounter shame, even in that act of abuse, even in the act of being mistreated by a teacher, being traumatized in a car accident, there's this sense in which my sudden awareness of being overwhelmed as a human being can easily evoke this state of vulnerability. We have talked in other episodes about the creation narrative, and at the end of Genesis chapter 2, this notion that the man and his wife were naked and unashamed, that their being unashamed is significant because it's absent in the very place where they could most vulnerably be hurt by it, in their nakedness. If we were to say, well, they were fully dressed and ready for work and they were unashamed, well, no one would be surprised at that. But we take note that they were vulnerable and shame was not in play. We protect ourselves in no small part because we are aware that at any given moment, shame could be in play for us. And as it turns out, as we've, in the old playground adage of sticks and stones can break my bones, but names will never hurt me. As it turns out, it's often, it's just not, that's not true. Right? Right. Names actually do hurt me as much, if not more, than sticks and stones do, because those names actually, not just because they take place in my mind, but because they affect my body as much as sticks and stones do. So shame, when I experience it, when I encounter it, is not just an emotional event, even though I experience it as such. It is an event that I feel, but that is mediated through my physicality. It takes up residence in our bodies. From the last episode, we talked about the autonomic nervous system quite a bit. And we recognize that the autonomic nervous system does a lot of things quite automatically, and it helps regulate our emotional states, regulates our function, but does so through our body. And with that polyvagal theory, that whole notion of staying within the window of tolerance and the notion of activating and engaging our social engagement system, all those things are ways for us to mitigate our experience of shame and to protect ourselves against it. And trauma has some features that shame really kind of latches onto, that when we are in these positions of great vulnerability, being overwhelmed, and we don't have access to agency to change that, those two pillars that define our perception of trauma, shame steps in, first of all, as a disintegrating force. We've talked here before on occasion about how when I'm in that place of shame, I can't connect my thoughts to my feelings, to my perceptions, to my physicality. And often I disconnect. Often I can, my body's memories, for example, get housed somewhere that's separate from my memory of the event itself. And as such, I can 10 years later be someplace where my body remembers something, is primed for something, and my body starts to have a reaction. And of course, because I don't always understand where that's coming from, I can often be, when I don't understand something about a lot of things, like I feel ashamed. It evokes shame. And so I don't just have the reaction. Shame also takes advantage of that disintegration. And because of that, I tend to isolate myself even further. This is another thing. So we have disintegration. We have isolation is the other thing that shame takes advantage of. Shame depends upon isolation in order for it to flourish, in order for it to be strengthened and activated. It needs me to be cut off from others and cut off from myself.
Isn't shame sometimes the impetus of isolation? Isn't shame, people feel shame and shame causes them to isolate?
Hence the self-perpetuation.
Yeah.
Right. That self-perpetuating feature of shame takes place in all three of these. Well, like we mentioned too, the disintegration, you're right, and the isolation, that isolation is something that I turn to cope with shame in the first place.
Yeah,
exactly. And the very moment that I then even imagine coming out of my isolation to look at you in the eye, I can't imagine that. It's too overwhelming. And so it drives me further into my isolation. And then when something else happens that re-evokes that feeling or that experience, I'm once again ashamed, and I'm going to work even harder. Somehow I got to work harder to keep that from overwhelming me. This self-perpetuation, this notion that it begets itself, is something that is quite striking in the sense that, we talk about joy being something that also begets itself, but it requires effort. It requires intentionality. I have great joy being in your presence. But I have to, it's kind of like I have great joy in preparing a beautiful meal that we sit down to, and there's great joy. But if I want to, that joy, if that's going to happen again tomorrow, like it's not going to happen automatically. Like we got to wash the dishes and we got to get the meal ready again. Like we're going to have to work to this. My joy of the meal causes me to want to have the joy of the next meal, but I had to put work into that. Shame doesn't require this. I feel shame, and it requires very little effort for that shame to be exacerbated and for it to be strengthened and repeated, perpetuated. So there's an intensification of the feelings associated with the trauma, like the event itself. What happened? Why didn't I do something different? How could I have stopped it? All those kinds of things. And the shame is infiltrating all of this. The very act of turning our attention toward it. I want to do something about it. But the moment that I do, I start to feel it. And so I once again want to turn away from it. And so when I do all these kinds of things in my mind in isolation, in the absence of anyone who's coming to help me, it tends to reinforce all of those disintegrating properties, including our coping responses. And at some point, my coping responses start to run out of steam. And that's when we discover that I can't get out of bed in the morning because it would take too much energy. Or I find that I'm at work, and even though I love my work, I can't focus my attention on my job. Or my relationship with my parents, or my relationship between my parents and my children is such that it's too overwhelming. And now I'm thinking even like, I don't even want to go there for Christmas at all, because there's just way too much history of what's happened in the trauma between my parents and me, or my parents and my siblings and so forth. And it's way too much for me. And so I turn away from this and disintegrate myself, cut myself off from family and even from myself. And we talked in our last episode about how one of the things that trauma does with our bodies is that it distorts our capacity to perceive things as they really are. My perceptions are all off.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they don't feel off to me. I'm reading them the best they can. And in fact, I'm reading them the best they can in order for me to survive the moments. But they just feel off. And I assume that what's off is not my perception. I assume that there's something wrong in the universe. If I could just get my parents to do this, if I could just get myself to do that, that I'd be in a very different place. And so the way I tell my story about the story, about the story that I think that I'm living in, that all gets distorted. And that has implications for the choices that I make. Those choices sometimes happen with everything as simple as like, well, I don't tolerate my awareness of what happened to me when I was a teenager and a young adult in this body. And so I'm going to make sure that nobody gets close to this body. And so I do whatever I can to put on as much weight as I possibly can to keep people from getting close to me. Or I'm going to make sure that nothing happens to me like what happened to my brother, because he was quote unquote lazy, according to my dad, who would beat him to a pulp. And so I'm working 80 hours a week. Now, my family never sees me, but my family has the house they need, the clothing they need, the food they need, the vacations, to the Rockies every February that they need. But they don't have me. And frankly, neither do I have me. And so I then have all these, what we would call microaggressions turned toward ourselves. I'm reading a book called Gentle and Lowly. And for the life of me, I'll have to get the author's name. Gentle and Lowly. And he is exploring Jesus' words in Matthew's gospel in chapter 11, where he says, all of you who labor and are heavy laden, come unto me, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And Pep, I read that, and as I've been reading through this book, it's really come to me. I'm actually really pretty hard on myself all the time. Now, anybody who, like my wife, would say, that's not really a mystery to me, Kurt. But even if I were to unpack it, I would say, I'm not even aware of the number of micro moments in which I am hard on myself throughout my day.
Death of a thousand cuts.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. And, we have, oh, by the way, Amy has just chimed in that Dane Ortland, thank you, Amy, is the author of this book, Gentle and Lowly. We have these traumatic events, and what shame does is it reinforces it with this death of a thousand cuts. I can't tell you, like, the number of patients that I have. I'm thinking of one in particular who's just worked so hard over a long period of time that I've been working with her, in which for many years, it was still difficult for her to not want to answer the question, if I had only done this, if I had only done that, what if I'd done this, what if I'd done that? And even though it is framed as a question, well, if I had only, then might I not have? What sounds at first glance like a question is really a statement, which is that, like, I didn't do it right. I didn't do it right. I didn't do it right. There's something wrong with me. Something wrong with me. And this is one of the things that this is how shame often piles on, as it were, in the wake of the traumatic events that we've encountered. And, in Ezekiel's text, we read of how God is going to take Israel's heart of stone and replace it with a heart of flesh. And, you hear about the notion of the hardening of the heart throughout the biblical text. We read about Pharaoh in the Exodus accounts. Don't harden your heart against the Lord your God. We hear this throughout the Old Testament. And I always thought, like, well, hardening your heart, it's just kind of a matter of I'm just going to kind of double down and just not do what God wants me to do. That's me harden my heart. Like, I'm going to kind of shake my fist at God, and I'm going to, no, I won't obey. Kind of that's one of the ways that I harden my heart. But, the other way, and I think that there's several ways that we can do this, but one of the ways that I harden my heart is through this death of a thousand cuts. Because it's not somebody else who's out there in the world saying to Kurt, you didn't do it right. You didn't do it right. No, this is me. Mm-hmm. And what I'm doing is the same kind of hardening that takes place when people kind of over time tamp down with their footfalls just a dirt road. With enough footfalls hitting the dirt road, it becomes hard as rock. And with my own internal dialogue, I am responding to my own trauma with that same kind of pounding, that self-inflicted microaggression. I remember, I was like 11 years old, and I'm at a church camp, and like it's the perfect time for hormones and pre-adolescent embarrassment to kind of be put on full display. Like, who knew that at Quaker Canyon Camp, right? That, like, it, there are elements of it internally that weren't very Quaker, but they felt very much like I was in a canyon. And all I remember is that I can't remember the guy's name, but like, so we're 11 years old, and it tells you like I'm 59, and that I am going to remember this with this kind of clarity tells you something.
Yeah.
Her name was Helen, and she was the most exquisite 11-year-old. Right. This was an 11-year-old's version of Eve, I'm sure. And there was, and I can't remember the other guy's name, but there was some other dude who had a crush on Helen, and he were a thing. And, you know, I'm even as an 11-year-old, I'm thinking, oh gosh, I want my Helen. And so there was another girl there that I can't remember what her name was, but I kind of took a liking to her. And so, you know, with all the courage that I could muster, I asked one of my friends to ask her if she might like me, because this is how much courage I had. And I remember, like, I was within earshot of that brief conversation. My friend was kind of like, you know, he was for me and so forth. And her response was not one of like, oh, that's so sweet. I'm sorry, I don't, but like, you know, I think he's really lovely. Like, no, it was kind of like this, no. Now, you know, this is not a traumatic event for the definition of trauma. But what I do in my mind from that moment on, it's like, oh no, okay, so I'm learning my lesson. Like, I'm not going to do that. Like you don't even, you're not even like by proxy, you don't say, because you don't want that to happen. But it doesn't keep me from continuing to say it in my head, like, no, you're not wanted. You're not interesting.
Right.
You're not, all the words that we can use. And so like we have these middle school experiences. And then, you know, like we like to talk about when I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who was an attorney. We were in our early 40s at the time. And so at this point, we were like 10 to 12 years into our profession. And he'd already made partner at his firm. I mean, he's just really bright, articulate, really effective at what he does. And I was doing okay. And we were having this conversation about like where we are in our profession. And I said, you know, I'm really kind of getting tired of continuing to go to medical conferences and always feel like I look around and think like I must be the dullest pencil in the box. I've got to be the dullest pencil in the box. And he said, I know. And this is a guy, like, just a wonderful guy. And he said, like, I'm kind of tired of being the guy who, even as a partner, I'm tired of being the guy who, when new clients come in and have a meeting with me, right? You're going to be a potential client meeting with me. Like, I'm thinking we have our conversation and then they say, so now can I speak to the attorney? Now, these aren't things that are happening to him. This is happening in his head. They're waiting for him to ask, like, well, when can we now speak to the real attorney? These are not traumatic in light of our topic, but they're the kind of ways that shame operates, such that when we do have traumatizing events, this kind of practice takes up residence within my mind and within my body, in which I become shame's conveyor belt. And we do this over and over and over and over and over again. And so if we are going to reverse this process, there are some things that'll be important for us to do. In order for us to reverse the story, as I say, by softening the body. So when God says, I'm going to give you a heart of flesh, it's going to require that I stop trying to get in his way by continuing to pound the living daylights out of myself, if ever so microscopically. One of the first things that we do is that we need to name the event. We name the event. So for our traumas, we name the event. Mm-hmm. And we name, and not just the event of like, oh, my teacher yelled at me in front of the class. Like, that is an event. But I want to name what we want to get this event down into frame by frame by frame within the movie. So I'm not just naming an event, I'm naming a series of events that all took place within about 30 seconds. I want to name what it was that was said and how it was said and where you sensed it and felt it and imaged it in your body. I want to name the event. And then we want to describe the manner in which shame accomplishes the things that we were talking about earlier, the disintegration, the isolation, and the self-perpetuation. We want to name where do, in this moment, what happens to my thoughts and my sensations and my images and my perceptions, just to describe it. Not to give into it and perpetuate it again, but just to pause and describe it. And remember, from our last episode, we talked about how, especially in that story that you talked about with your daughter, and about how you were able to enable, you helped her stay with and come back to within her window of tolerance, strengthening her social engagement system by partnering with her, by connecting with her. And so we need others who we're going to name this event to in the way that we're talking about. That we describe the manner in which shame senses that we're like that we feel disintegrated, that we sense and image and feel and think, how those things are being separated, how we want to turn and isolate ourselves. We want to turn away. We want to name those things. What are the things that I'm doing right now to turn away? Again, being careful to recognize that even in the act of naming how I'm isolating, I can feel ashamed that I'm doing all these things.
Right. That's that self-perpetuation, in case you were wondering.
Exactly. You're getting better at that word.
Thank you.
Right. You're becoming perpetually more articulate.
What you said. You know, I just want to say that a couple of weeks ago, we were having a conversation, you and I and Amy, off air. And what the subject was doesn't really matter. But I was naming some things about struggle that I was having. And then I turned to start naming myself in that struggle, like calling myself names, basically.
Yeah, I remember. Yep.
And the response that the both of you had was so unbelievably helpful. For it, you know, it was, wait a minute. You know, you paused for me to hear what I was saying about myself. And the both of you pointed out sort of a lie that I was telling myself. And that co-regulation that the two of you were doing on my behalf and with me was just so helpful on so many ways, in so many layers. And yeah, that's well, I tell you, it's for me doing this podcast, that's the joy of it, because this isn't just us sitting here and talking to each other. This is, I mean, it's an experience. I mean, it's living this out and embodying it. And
it's well, I mean, I as we've said often here, you know, one of the reasons why I so look forward to doing this, even though we're not in the same room at the same time,
right?
I look forward to our time because I'm looking forward to feeling the presence of you and Amy in my chest, and that it literally gives my solar plexus right through my pelvis to like where I'm seated, right down to my feet, like a sense of groundedness, a sense of like solid. And that's comforting, this sense of being regulated and being comfortable and confident in my own physicality. And I and so you know, that story that you just told, you know, you have offered the same balm for me on many occasions. And you know, this thing about trauma and memory, we haven't talked an awful lot about this, but you know, we can have these experiences, and this is where shame, you know, we talked in our last episode about how shame rides on these rails often of the dorsal vagal nerve. It's non-myelinated, which means once it fires, it takes a long time to undo it. And shame is like this. Once it fires, it's hard for us to just quickly snap our fingers and just get out of it. Which is why, saying to someone, well, you don't need to be ashamed of that, is often really quite unhelpful, because you tell me this and yet I am. And so now I'm ashamed because I am ashamed and I shouldn't be ashamed, but I am. And this is how it works. And so this notion of being present for us, of just creating space and identifying, like, this is the lie, but we want you to know that we're with you. I want you to pay more attention to that. And in so doing, one of the first things that we're then able to do is to recognize where shame is taking up residence in where it's taking up residence in my body. If I just think of it as an abstraction, I'm ashamed and I feel it, but I'm not noticing it where it is in my body, then I can't really do much about it. But as soon as I notice where it is in my body, if I feel it in my chest, and I say, well, put your hand over your chest. Take a breath. Now, as you take a breath, I want you to just pay attention to feeling your hand on your chest and feeling your chest with your hand as you breathe. And in so doing, we've taken an event in which shame is the neurophysiologically mediated experience, and we are changing it. We're not ignoring it. We're not running away from it. We're not dissociating from it. We are with it and looking at it and being present with it. And in that presence, we are moving back into the window within the window of tolerance. We are strengthening the social engagement system, because it is the social engagement system and its activation that is coming to our rescue in the middle of our shame. And typically, our shame acts in such a way that as soon as I have it, I jettison, and I'm turning away from everybody. So nobody's social engagement system ever has a chance to connect with me.
Right.
But like you and your daughter in our last episode that we described, and like you and I and Amy have shared on so many occasions. But once we identify these things, we've named the event, we're describing the manner in which shame does what it does, and we've identified where it takes up residence in our body. A next step that is often difficult for us, and that is, and this step takes time, but I really appreciate the work of Dan Allender, in his lifetime's worth of work. If you don't know of Dan Allender, I would recommend that you run, don't walk to find his name and the work that he has done over the last 30 years. But in a number of his works, he talks about the need for us to repent of our collaboration with shame and our agreement with the accuser in our willingness to believe the lies that we have taken upon ourselves. This is tricky because it can sound at first glance like, well, Kurt, are you saying like this is like what I'm feeling and sensing is like it's all my fault? To be very clear and say, what happened to you was responsible to someone else. Someone else did this, like things that happened to you, there were other people's responsibilities, and that is true and always will be true. The challenge for us is that, if I had that single event, right, where when I was 11 years old and whoever she was said something on the trail that I heard that was embarrassing, I then respond to it with a certain way of telling my story about myself from then on out. And she doesn't have anything to do with that. That's all me. Now, Jesus isn't standing, hovering and saying, well, Kurt, that's all you. But he is standing and saying, I want you to tell a different story. And the role that you play in reinforcing the trauma needs to be reckoned with, needs to be addressed, because I want you not to participate with the trauma. I want you not to collaborate with the shame. I want you not to live in agreement with the accuser. And I've just been discovering in the last several months the kind of like small, infinite number of granular moments and ways in which I agree with accuser. To this day, I agree with the accuser. I'm not this enough. I'm not that enough. I haven't done this well enough. I haven't, I practice agreeing with the accuser. And the collective long-term effect of this is the weight that I carry that Jesus talks about in Matthew's gospel. All of you who labor and are heavy laden. A lot of that labor is carrying the memory of what happened to me, but a lot of that labor is carrying the memory of what I have repeatedly done to myself over and over and over and over again. And so it's important for us to repent, and repent means simply to turn around and to make a different choice. It does mean refraining and restraining myself from naming these things about myself that I tend to want to name. And it's hard for me to stop doing that. Hard for me to stop that. But we make those confessions and we name those things with each other. And one of the most powerful ways that we can practice doing that is, as we've talked about throughout the course of our time on this podcast, not just this season, but we long for our listeners to be captivated, immersed, and create beauty wherever they are. So one of the ways that my death of 1,000 cuts can be mitigated is by putting myself in the path of oncoming beauty. And in those moments when I identify and am aware of the things about me that I hate the most, it's then when Jesus invites me to look upon beauty. It's then when Jesus invites me, as Dane Ortland talks about, to consider that he knows exactly what it's like for me to be me, yet without sin. That he knows what it's like for me to carry the load that I carry. And he's not worried, nor is he embarrassed by me. Now, this is hard for me to get around in my head. But if we are not willing to address the shame that our trauma, that often inhabits so much of our trauma, it's going to be difficult for us to move forward in healing. And I think we talk about this being done in an embodied context. Then we're going to do all these things by this, I don't just mean our own bodies, that we're doing it in the context of community, in the context of other bodies who, like you were describing in our conversation a couple times back, we were off air, like that realization isn't going to come to me or come to you on our own. Not when I'm stuck down that rabbit hole. It's going to have to come to me from you, from outside my head. And, I remember this experience of one patient who had, we talked about it a little bit in the Soul of Desire, but there were a person who just had a terribly traumatizing set of circumstances that had her telling this same narrative over and over and over again, that she just wasn't going to be enough. She wasn't going to be wanted by a man. She wasn't going to be, let alone wanted by a church community, or let alone, this community of people that she was in our confessional community. And I think we talked a little bit about this situation before, but in the course of the confessional community, there was a throwaway comment that she made that one of the other gentlemen in the group picked up on, is that she had, was a painter at one point in time. Mm-hmm. And her story is one in which, over the course of time, of her being seen, soothed, safe, secure, and naming her traumas and doing the embodied work over time, and not allowing shame to have not even a square inch of life, that over time, this other group member continued to come back and revisit this question about, I really want to see one of your works. And as we've said on a previous episode, and as we read in the book, she now has work displayed in many different places because someone came for her. And that trauma that was using shame as a primary weapon in the context of community didn't just find a way for her to reintegrate and come back to baseline and just no longer feel bad, but it enabled her and even commissioned her to be doing things that she'd never really done before. So I think for our listeners, we want to be people who are unafraid of our shame and who know that Jesus is coming for all of it, has come for all of it, is sitting in the middle of it, and is simply waiting for us to turn our eyes toward him so that we can together do something about it. And as such, begin to recognize the way in which the trauma that has affected our bodies and our brains, in fact, our entire minds, can not only be healed, but can be regenerated to create beauty and goodness in ways that we've never imagined possible.
Yeah. You know, in your book, Soul of Desire, and in our season 3 of the podcast, we talked about a lot of this stuff in depth and talked about the 3 things of dwelling, gazing, and inquiring. And, you know, it just more and more, it's coming back to me that this is the key, that if you can find a place to come who you are with your shame, with your trauma and everything else, where you can tell your story more truly. You can dwell with people that are going to stay with you and sit with you in it, that you're going to find you're going to do this for others and they're going to do it for you as you inquire with them and you ask them questions about things. And then you're going to sit in one another's gaze and and together, is the only way it can be done. And we've also talked about the fact that it's not easy. It takes courage to do these things. And, if I've heard it once, I've heard it 1,000 times. I've said it myself, but I've gotten hurt. I've shared things with people and they've shared them with other people when I really, we were supposed to be confidential. And I've heard back that people were saying things, all that stuff. We've all been hurt by other people. And I loved the illustration that you had. It's like putting the bucket down the well and bringing it up and it's dry, but you got to keep putting the bucket down the well and bring it up. And eventually, you'll find the people that you can sit with, that you can dwell with, that you can do this work with, you can share your story with as truly as you can. And it all leads to beauty. Yeah. So Kurt, I know you have exercise application we can do this week to help us understand a little better within ourselves what we're talking about here.
Yeah. So for our exercise this week, simple way to get at this would be to consider one event in which you've experienced shame that you recall has registered in your body, and be attentive to what that embodied experience was like. So you can write about that experience and how you recall responding to it. We've talked already about how did you find yourself disintegrated? In other words, from what you were sensing, separated from what you were imaging and feeling and thinking. How did you find yourself experiencing being in isolation? In what way do you recall that the shame became self-perpetuating? How did you find yourself to be practicing what we're calling these self-inflicted microaggressions and wounds in response to the event? Well, I should have known better. I shouldn't have done this. I should have done that. And those microaggressions just continue on and on and on. And then really, Pepper, to your point, who has provided for you an embodied experience of the reversal of those events? And if you can name someone, consider writing to them and thanking them. And if you can't name someone, consider one person that you trust and consider sharing with them the things that we've been talking about here. Because in the end, we really do believe that that kind of work really is the basis for what you were talking about just a moment ago, Pepper, this notion that we flourish as humans when we find ourselves in places where we are able to dwell, able to gaze, and able to inquire for the purpose of creating beauty and goodness, even in the face of tribulation, even in the face of our traumas.
Kurt, as always, time well spent. I appreciate you so
Thanks,
much.
brother.
You know that, right?
Oh, right back at you, man. Right back at you.
Yeah.
All day, every day.
Yes. Stick around, everybody. If you're on YouTube, we've got a conversation coming up with Amy, who always enlightens us about what we're trying to say. She makes it so much better than what's come out of our mouths. So stick around for that.
People are like, wait, can we just get to Amy? Can we please get her on air?
You know that people on YouTube, if they had the data, it would be a fast forward all the way through you and I.
Just
and then it would just be
I know.
Yeah.
How long? Hey, wait, how long is that? How
Cut
long
to
is
the
the
chase.
podcast? Oh, it's about 10 minutes. It's about 10 minutes long. Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The important part.
The best part is at the end.
Yes. All right, man. Thank you so much.
Right,
Until next time.
Right.
Love you.
Love you too.
Okay, so immediately I thought of a story. What hit me first was, like, Kurt, when you said joy takes effort. And if I'm preparing a meal, it takes a lot of effort if that's the place I'm looking to create joy. But so there are other ways.
Yeah.
But that it takes work, but then shame, like, it doesn't take much work at all.
No.
And I have a story. One of my friends' little girls, she was walking. So do you walk at 2 or?
Yeah, you can walk at 2.
So maybe it was she was walking, but like toddling.
Yeah.
And in my neighborhood, there are people have put up swings like on their trees out front for everybody to use as they want. So I would take her to the swing. I took her to one of the swings, and it was one of those where you buckle her in like a little bucket thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was pushing her. She was swinging, and the rope. She was fine. She's fine. I will start with that. She was fine. But the rope broke, and she and the little bucket went flying. And immediately, and there was a brick wall that she was headed right toward. And, just immediately my world sunk. I thought,
did the airbags deploy?
Yeah. I wish we had airbags to deploy.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I'm watching this and I'm feeling this, right? Like, oh yeah.
So I go get her and I just scoop her up. She's not screaming. And then I'm like, well, maybe you should be screaming. Why aren't you screaming? She ended up to be 100% fine, but it took me forever in that moment in that day to just come off of that.
Right.
But then after that, I felt so much shame about, like, how could I let that happen? And why didn't what could I have done? Like, gone and checked all the swings. And then I was angry. Like, right. Why don't you people check your swings? Like, and I had 2 thoughts about that. One, the ease of getting back to that shame is like, all I have to do is think about that swing. And
it doesn't take much.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
But the 2 things I thought is it's lingering. And like, Kurt, when you talked about the lies, like, what lies do we believe? The fabulous thing is there's work and it's work that can be done. Like identifying the lies that we believe. We have to work at that. Thank God there's work to be done. And then like having a community, have a trusted one or a trusted group. Then as we share little shames and we see someone look us in the eye and tell us the truth of it and accept the truth, then I anticipate that the next time I maybe share a little bigger shame.
That's right.
And it perpetuates this whole other experience.
Right. And, one of the things though, too, that's really interesting, one of the phrases I give patients is, you can work hard and stay in prison, or you can work hard and go free. but like hard work isn't an option. Like you're gonna work hard,
Right.
but the kind of work that you do to stay in prison or to go free is categorically a different kind of work.
Yeah.
You're going to burn energy, but it's going to be a very different kind of energy that you're going to burn. And so, one of the things that happens is like, we share these smaller shames, and then we have the courage to share the next level.
Right.
And somehow we think that, oh, okay, I've done this. Okay, I can do this now, right? And then you get to the next level and you're like, wait a minute, I thought it would actually be easier.
Yeah.
And it feels more difficult. And in fact, it is. But this is where, like we say, like evil is awake and active 24/7. Like it is not going to bed. Evil will want to say, well, Kurt, if you really had made progress, then this should be easier.
It wouldn't be hard. Yeah.
It wouldn't be hard. Without recognizing that, no. Actually, if I give into shame, the next time something like this happens, it will be easier for me to give in even more to shame. It will take even less effort for me to capitulate to that.
Right.
So it's kind of like, if my choice is to stay on the couch instead of going to lift, the next time the option is there, it will be even easier for me to stay on the couch. Whereas if I go to choose to lift, I lift, but if the next time I go to choose to lift, there's going to be more weight on the bar.
Yeah. And what Amy and I've talked about this before, that when you're in a season and you're really working out and you're taking care of yourself and you feel so good, right? Because, the endorphins, and you're just, and it's like, why do I ever not do this? Right. And then you stop for whatever reason, you get hurt or something, you stop.
Yeah. Right.
It is the hardest thing in the world to start again.
Oh.
Even though you have the memory of how awesome it was, it also is hard. It also, to get to that place, it's work to get, to even get to those feelings. But it's like, it's the hard, once you stop, it's so hard to start again. Yeah.
Well, and it takes 6 months to get fit and 6 minutes to get out of shape.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, I had the flu. Now I'm out.
This world that we're living in, where shame perpetuates itself, joy, you got to work your tail off to have any. What is the deal?
What's the deal?
What is the deal?
I know. Right. I got questions for Jesus.
Yeah.
Right. Well, it's funny that this happens a lot with our patients. This notion that, they're doing all this progressive work. There are a number of people that are coming to mind. They're doing all this work that is demonstrating,
it gets harder and harder.
Yeah, but they're basically, they used to, like, they couldn't lift the 45-pound bar, let alone put any weight on it. And now, like, they're benching 200, right? This is what they're doing.
Right.
And the next thing comes along and, now it's 205 that's on the bar. And they're like, this isn't supposed to be this hard. And the thing is, like, there's the work of the extra weight. And then there is the work of changing the perception of what increasing the weight actually means. With my left brain, I can know, if I'm benching 200 and before I couldn't even bench the bar, like that's a sign, that's a good sign. But like in the moment when you put 205 on the bar, like this doesn't, like, why? Like, it is so easy for me to reactivate old neural networks that equate that there is something that I cannot do well in the moment. It echoes old stories. It echoes old stuff, old traumatic events. And this is some of the news that we work with patients of trauma, is to say, I just want you to know that you can make real gains. You can move toward places of flourishing, and not to be surprised at what might happen somewhere down the road when you're in a much healthier place and something happens. And it feels like the world is falling apart again. I may have told this story before. My friend Byron, with whom I played basketball with for 20 years, 2 times a week. And one night we're playing and he falls under the basket and he shatters his elbow. Ugh. And for our, many of you may know, it's one of the worst fractures that a human can have in many respects for a lot of different reasons. He has surgery and he reworks it and he's fine. And so, but it's 6 weeks or whatever it takes him to get, rehabbed and everything back. And so he's fine. A year later, we're playing.
Oh no.
And somebody just dings his elbow. Like it's fine. Like his elbow is completely healed. It's fine. Uh-huh. Dings his elbow and it drops him to the floor. Because the bone fracture lines, like the nerve endings, take time to completely reknit in a way. The bone remembers. And in that moment, it feels like 12 months ago when you just wanted to cut your arm off. And this is kind of what trauma can sometimes do, which is why it's really important for us to have community around us all the time that can say, oh, yeah, that's what this is. Mm-hmm. And look at us, watch listen to my voice, look at my eyes. We're mm-hmm. with you. Mm-hmm. Right? This sense, I think about Luke's rendition at the end of Jesus' temptations in the desert. Luke's rendition says, and the devil left him for another time. That there was going to be another time coming. Mm-hmm. And after you've been through all that, and I think this is true for each of us, that even as we are on the road to healing of our trauma, that along the way, there will be moments when things can reignite and reactivate old remembered experiences that feel like unto that have resonance with old things. And that can tempt us to think we're just headed down the same rabbit hole, but in fact we don't, and we're not.
Right.
And we don't have the flashback. And the thing that used to, if it woke me up in the morning, it was with me all day. Now I think about it during the day and it bothers me a little bit, but doesn't keep me from going to sleep at night. And so right. These kinds of things can we definitely can find healing, but that healing can take time. And even in the process of that healing practice, evil will want to use shame every opportunity it gets, even to kind of distort our interpretation and perception of the healing process itself. And this is why we need community to be able to say, yep, that makes sense. Mm-hmm. But we are here and we're not leaving the room. And we want you to pay attention to us, not that thing that's banging around in your head.
And we saw you when you were laying on the floor in a fetal position, and now you're standing up straight. Let's count every victory, right? I joke, but really, It's like you need people that are seeing you on your journey so they can point those kind of things out to you when you think you've not made a difference.
They have a different perspective.
Yeah,
right.
And to your point, Kurt, like the idea that it's hard work. So we just want to do the right hard work, right? It's hard work to ignore shame and to try to dodge and weave.
Yep.
It's like somebody said, and I have to look it up. It tastes like salt. Does that mean anything to either of you?
It feels familiar.
It's I'll have to look it up, but it's the idea that it's rich. It's if it tastes like salt, that's good. That's life-giving. It's the right kind of pain. It's the right mm-hmm. kind of work. Mm-hmm. It's the right kind mm-hmm. of hard.
Yeah. It's good. It's good.
That's from my book.
That is yet to be written.
It's entitled The Rim of a Margarita Glass. Subtitled, It Tastes Like Salt.
I'll have one.
Well, it is Friday.
I'll have one and then another, I think.
Yes. Hey, you guys, thanks for today. This was really...
It's great.
This was really great.
Yeah, right on.
Yeah. Thank you.
Good.
This podcast is produced by Kurt Thompson, Pepper Sweeney, and myself, Amy Chella. Audio production and editing is by Keaton Simons. Video production and editing is done by Mark Gould. If you'd like to connect with us, you can find us on social media at Being Known Pod. If you like this podcast, tell a friend. If you love this podcast, tell everyone you know. And please like, rate, and review wherever you listen. Be well, be known.